Ryan Garrett had not lost a fight in 4 years. Not in the yard at Corcoran. Not in the transfer to Pelican Bay. Not in the 18 months since his release, when the reputation that the prison circuit had built around him had followed him back into the civilian world like a second shadow, heavier than the first, and more useful in the specific contexts that Ryan Garrett's civilian world tended to produce. He was 34 years old in the summer of 1986, and he was 6'3" and weighed 340 pounds of the specific kind of weight that 4 years of prison yard training produces in a man who has nothing to do with his time except eat and sleep and lift and fight, which is not the aesthetic weight of competitive bodybuilding or the functional weight of athletic training for a specific sport, but the dense, compacted weight of a body that has been made as large and as hard as the available conditions permit, because in the available conditions, largeness and hardness were the most valuable assets a man could develop, and the development of them was therefore the organizing principle of every waking hour that the institution did not organize otherwise. Snorts. His fighting record in the yard had been built on a foundation of genuine physical dominance over men who were themselves genuinely physically capable, men who had also been spending their available hours making themselves as large and as hard as the conditions permitted, and who had discovered through the specific testing of the yard that Ryan Garrett was larger and harder than they were, and that the discovery had consequences that the yard did not cushion with the managed conditions that civilian combat sports provided. He had won those fights the way large, strong men win fights when they are fighting other large, strong men, which is through the application of overwhelming forward pressure and the specific confidence of a man who has learned that his physical presence alone reorganizes the available options of the men he is confronting before a single strike has been thrown. The confidence was real. The physical capability behind it was real. The reputation was real in the sense that reputations are real when they have been built through the direct and honest testing of the capability they describe, rather than through the institutional machinery that builds reputations for men who have not been honestly tested. What was not real, though Ryan Garrett did not know this yet, in the summer of 1986 was his understanding of what genuine fighting capability looked like in men who had developed it through a path different from the one he had taken. His path had been the path of size and strength, and the forward pressure of a man whose body had been developed to a standard that most opponents could not match, and whose confidence in the standard had been confirmed repeatedly by opponents who could not match it. The path he had not traveled, and the capability he had therefore not encountered, was the capability of a man who had spent 26 years developing not the ability to overwhelm opponents through superior size and forward pressure, but the ability to make superior size and forward pressure irrelevant through the management of the specific variables that size and forward pressure depend on to function, which were the variables of distance and timing, and the specific reading of committed movement that a man develops when he has spent enough years inside the practice of a genuine martial art, under conditions that required the development to be real rather than theoretical. Clears throat. Ryan Garrett encountered that capability on a Thursday afternoon in August of 1986 at a sporting goods warehouse in Gardena, California, where he had been working since his release in a loading and inventory capacity that suited his particular combination of physical capability and limited patience for the organizational requirements of more structured employment. He encountered it in the specific form of Chuck Norris, who was 46 years old that summer and who had come to the warehouse not to encounter Ryan Garrett, but because the warehouse's owner, a man named Sal Benedetti, who had been a training partner of Chuck's in the early 1970s and who had maintained the connection across the intervening years with the consistency of a man who valued what the connection was built on, had called him about a piece of equipment that had come in and that he thought Chuck would want to look at before it went to the floor. Chuck had driven over from the valley on a Thursday afternoon because Sal had asked him to, and because Chuck made it a practice to show up for the people who had been genuine in their relationship with him across long enough that the genuineness had been established beyond the reach of any particular circumstance to revise it. The warehouse on a Thursday afternoon was operating at the reduced pace that large commercial spaces operate at when the morning's receiving work is finished and the afternoon's shipping preparation has not yet begun. The specific in-between pace of a workplace that has a rhythm and is currently between its rhythms. 6 people were working, 3 in the back receiving area. Sal at the office window that looked out over the main floor, a woman named Dora at the administrative desk near the entrance, and Ryan Garrett moving pallets in the central aisle with the electric pallet jack that he operated with the specific competence of a man who has learned to use a piece of equipment because the equipment is what the job requires, and the learning of it was therefore not optional. Snorts. Chuck came through the side entrance that Sal had told him to use, the entrance that opened onto the main floor rather than the receiving area, and he walked across the main floor toward the office window where Sal was waiting with the easy, unhurried pace he brought to everything. He was wearing jeans and a plain dark shirt, and the boots he wore most days, and he looked the way he looked in warehouses and in restaurants and in dojos and on film sets and at gas stations and in every other context the world placed him in, which was like a man who was exactly where he was and not somewhere else, which is a quality that is more uncommon than it sounds, and that people who pay attention to other people tend to notice immediately, even when they cannot name what they are noticing. Ryan Garrett noticed it without naming it. He noticed it in the way he noticed most things in spaces he occupied, which was with the rapid physical assessment that the yard had trained into him as a survival mechanism and that had become across 4 years of practice as automatic as breathing. The assessment ran its process. It returned its conclusion. The conclusion was the conclusion the assessment had been returning for 4 years in the yard and for 18 months since, which was that the man being assessed was not a relevant variable in the management of the space. Clear's throat. He said something. He said it from the pallet jack in the central aisle, in the carrying voice of a man who has not developed the habit of moderating his volume for spaces that other people also occupy, because the spaces he had occupied for the previous 4 years had not rewarded the moderation of volume. He said it in the direction of Dora at the administrative desk, but loud enough that the entire main floor of the warehouse received it, which was the specific acoustic calculation of a man who wants an audience for what he is saying, while maintaining the technical position that he is saying it to a specific person rather than to the room. He said that the guy who just came in looked like he couldn't lift one end of a pallet. He said it with the particular quality of humor that men develop in environments where the hierarchy of physical capability is the primary social organizing principle, and where commentary on the physical capability of others is the currency of the social exchange that the hierarchy produces. He said it with the smile of a man who has been the largest and strongest person in his environment for long enough that the assessment of other men's physical capability has become both a habit and a pleasure. Snorts. Sal heard it from the office window. He looked at Ryan Garrett. He looked at Chuck. He had known Chuck for 15 years and had trained alongside him for 3 of those years and had sat across from him at enough tables and on enough mats to have developed the specific knowledge of Chuck that genuine proximity over genuine time produces, which is not the knowledge of what a man says about himself, but the knowledge of what a man is when the situation makes what he is visible. He said nothing. He looked at Chuck with the expression of a man who is waiting to see what his friend is going to do with a specific piece of information and who has enough knowledge of his friend to have a strong prior on the answer. Chuck had heard it. He had heard it in the specific way that he heard most things, which was completely and without the filtering that most people apply to ambient sound in spaces they are moving through. The filtering that reduces most background communication to noise and preserves only the specific signal that the person is specifically attending to. He had heard it and had processed it and had continued walking toward the office window at the same pace he had been walking at before he heard it, which was the unhurried pace of a man who has one task in front of him and is doing it. He reached the office window, he said hello to Sal, he asked about the equipment. Clear's throat. Ryan Garrett watched him reach the office window and greet the owner and ask about the equipment with the expression of a man who has made a comment about someone and expected the comment to produce a specific response in the room, which was the response of acknowledgement, of the room recognizing the comment and organizing itself around its conclusion, and who has instead observed the subject of the comment proceed to the office window without any indication that the comment has been received at all. The absence of the expected response produced in Ryan Garrett the specific discomfort that the absence of expected responses tends to produce in men who have been receiving expected responses for long enough that the expectation has become structural rather than situational. He climbed off the pallet jack. He walked toward the office window. He walked with the specific quality of movement that 340 pounds of prison yard development produces in a man who has decided to move toward something, which is the movement of an object whose mass communicates its intention before the intention has been formally expressed. Snorts. He stopped behind Chuck. He said that he had made a remark, and that the remark had not been acknowledged, and that in his experience, remarks that were not acknowledged were remarks that required clarification about whether the acknowledgement had been prevented by distance or by choice. He said this in the carrying voice he used for everything. Chuck turned around. He looked at Ryan Garrett with the open, settled expression that the people who had been in these situations with him recognized immediately as the expression of a man who has assessed what is in front of him and has arrived at a complete understanding of it and who is now deciding what the understanding requires. The expression was not threatening. It was not the performed composure of a man who is actually agitated and is managing the agitation for the benefit of the room. It was simply the expression of a man who was seeing what was in front of him accurately and who had enough experience seeing things accurately to be settled rather than agitated by the accuracy of the seeing. Clear's throat. He said that he had heard the remark. He said it without any particular inflection. He said that he was going to finish his conversation with Sal, and that after he had finished it he would be glad to address whatever Ryan Garrett wanted to address. He said it in the calm, even tone of a man stating what was going to happen rather than asking permission for it to happen. Ryan Garrett looked at him. He looked at him the way he looked at men in the yard when the men had said something that the yard required him to respond to in a way that removed any ambiguity about the hierarchy of the space. He said that he didn't think the conversation with Sal was what needed to happen first. He said it with the specific physical quality of a man who is using the communication of his body to supplement the communication of his words. The quality of a man whose body is moving fractionally closer, even as the words are being produced, the movement that men make when they want the person they are addressing to understand that the words are not the operative instrument of the communication. Snorts, Sal stepped out of the office. He said Ryan's name once. He said it in the flat, carrying voice of an employer who has assessed a situation and is making one attempt to address it through the normal operational authority of the employment relationship, before the situation moves past the point where that authority is the relevant instrument. Ryan Garrett looked at Sal. He looked at Chuck. He said that this was between him and the man in front of him, and that the man in front of him had made a choice when he didn't respond to the remark, and that the choice had a consequence, and that the consequence was what was about to happen. He said it with the complete confidence of a man who has never in 4 years of being exactly this size, in exactly this condition, in front of exactly this kind of situation, had the confidence fail to produce what the confidence predicted it would produce. He reached for Chuck's shirt with his right hand. Clear's throat, the hand did not reach the shirt. What it reached instead arrived so far in advance of what it expected to reach that the two people in the warehouse who were watching from the far end of the main floor described the subsequent event as something their eyes had received, but their minds had required several seconds to organize into a coherent sequence because the sequence had moved through the available duration at a speed that real-time visual processing had been insufficient to fully track. Chuck's left hand met Ryan Garrett's incoming right wrist at the specific point in its travel where the wrist lock that followed required it to be met. The lock was applied in the continuing motion of the interception, not as a separate action following the interception, but as the same action, the interception and the lock being not two things but one thing that began at the wrist and communicated itself through the joint and into the shoulder, and through the shoulder into the structure of a 340-pound body whose forward momentum was now being redirected through a joint at an angle that the joint was not designed to travel, and that the forward momentum was amplifying rather than resisting because the forward momentum could not be recalled once the lock had redirected it. Snorts. Ryan Garrett went down. He went down in the specific way that large men go down when a joint lock has been applied correctly to a forward-moving body, which is not the way that large men go down in films, which involves extended airtime and theatrical impact, but the way that large men go down in the actual application of a correctly executed technique, which is with the specific inevitability of a structure whose foundation has been removed before the structure had the opportunity to reorganize itself around the removal. He went to the concrete floor of the warehouse in Gardena on one knee and then to both knees as the lock's continuation required the adjustment from one knee to both, and his body made the adjustment with the specific automaticity of a body whose nervous system has received an instruction from a joint that it does not have the option of declining to follow. He was on both knees on the concrete floor, with his right arm extended at the angle the lock maintained it at, and with the specific expression of a man whose prior model of the situation has just been replaced by a new model that the prior model had not included as a possibility. Clear's throat. 8 seconds. Dora, at the administrative desk, had been watching since Ryan Garrett climbed off the pallet jack and would later estimate the duration from the moment his hand moved toward Chuck's shirt to the moment both knees were on the concrete at 8 seconds, which she arrived at through the specific counting method of a person who has been keeping time involuntarily and who has a natural internal rhythm that produces accurate estimates without the deliberate application of a timer. 8 seconds from the reaching hand to the concrete floor. 2 seconds inside the margin that the 8 seconds of a title suggested, and 6 seconds faster than Ryan Garrett's prior model of the situation had estimated any sequence involving him and a man of Chuck's dimensions could conclude in a direction unfavorable to Ryan Garrett. Snorts. Chuck held the lock for the 3 seconds required to establish that it was established, and that the establishment was not going to change in any direction that Ryan Garrett preferred. Then he released it. He stepped back 2 paces. He stood with his hands at his sides and his weight even on both feet and his eyes on Ryan Garrett with the open, patient expression he had been wearing since before Ryan Garrett climbed off the pallet jack. He said one thing. He said it in the same calm, even tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a man making an observation rather than delivering a verdict. He said that the floor was harder than it looked. He said it without irony and without the particular satisfaction that lesser men take from moments like this one. He said it in the tone of a man offering useful and accurate information about a surface that the person he was addressing had just made direct contact with and who therefore had the most immediate available basis for evaluating the accuracy of the information. Then he turned back to the office window. He looked at Sal. He said that he would like to see the equipment now if Sal was ready. Clears throat. Sal looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has known someone for 15 years, and who has watched them do something in those 15 years that still manages to produce in him the specific quality of response that genuine surprise produces even when the thing that produced it is entirely consistent with everything the 15 years of knowing has established. He said that the equipment was in the back, and that he would take Chuck there now. They walked toward the back of the warehouse together. The sound of their footsteps on the concrete floor was the loudest sound in the warehouse for approximately 10 seconds after they began walking, which was approximately how long it took for Ryan Garrett to complete the process of getting from both knees back to a standing position. He stood with the specific physical care of a man whose right shoulder joint has recently received information that the joint had not previously received, and whose body is conducting a thorough assessment of the consequences of the information before committing to full weight-bearing movement. He stood, and he looked at the direction Chuck and Sal had walked, and he stood there for a moment with the expression that Dora would describe afterward to her husband and to her sister and to several people she worked with as the expression of a man who had walked into a room with a specific understanding of how the world worked and was walking out of it with a different understanding and was still in the process of making the adjustment between the two. Snorts. He went back to the pallet jack. He got on it. He resumed the work that the afternoon required of him with the specific quality of resumed work that is different from the work that preceded the interruption. The quality of a man doing the work in a different internal state than the state he was doing it in before the interruption. The state of a man who is doing the work and also doing something else simultaneously, which is the internal processing of an experience that has revised something structural in his understanding of how the world works, and that the work is proceeding alongside rather than replacing. He did not speak for the remainder of the afternoon. He did not make any additional remarks. Dora noticed the silence and understood what it contained, but did not remark on it because the silence was doing something useful, and remarking on it would have interrupted the useful thing it was doing. Clears throat. Chuck spent 40 minutes with Sal in the back of the warehouse looking at the equipment and talking about the things that the two of them talked about when they were together, which were the things that men who have known each other across 15 years of genuine connection talk about, which are the practice and the people they have trained with, and the specific questions that the practice keeps producing regardless of how many years of the practice have preceded the producing. He bought the equipment. He said goodbye to Sal at the side entrance. He walked to his car and drove back toward the valley. He did not mention Ryan Garrett or the concrete floor, or the 8 seconds to Sal during the 40 minutes, or at the side entrance, or at any subsequent point in the following years, when the two men were together, because the encounter had been complete when it was complete, and adding language to it afterward would have been the kind of addition that reduces rather than honors what the original contained. Snorts. Sal told the story to 3 people he trusted in the following week. He told it with the specific accuracy of a man who had watched every second of it from the office window, and who had 15 years of context for what he had watched, and who understood therefore not just what had happened, but what had happened meant in the context of what produced it, which was the context of a man who had spent 26 years developing a specific quality of capability under conditions that required the capability to be real, and who had been carrying that capability into ordinary spaces like warehouse floors in Gardena on Thursday afternoons for all of those 26 years, without requiring the ordinary spaces to acknowledge the capability or to organize themselves around it, and who was therefore available to be genuinely underestimated by the people who encountered him in those ordinary spaces in a way that a man who required the ordinary spaces to acknowledge his capability was not available to be genuinely underestimated. Clear's throat. The underestimation was part of the story, not as an embarrassment to the man who underestimated, as the specific mechanism through which the story's most important content was delivered, which was the content about the difference between the kind of capability that announces itself and requires the room to recognize it before it can function, and the kind of capability that does not announce itself and does not require the room, and that functions therefore in the specific conditions of the genuine encounter with a completeness that the announcing kind cannot match, because the announcing kind has spent its available energy on the announcement rather than on the capability the announcement was supposed to represent. Ryan Garrett had the announcing kind. He had developed it honestly and under genuine pressure, and it was real within the domain in which it had been developed and tested. He had not encountered the other kind before the Thursday afternoon in Gardena, and the encounter with it had lasted 8 seconds and had revised his understanding of the domain in which his own capability operated in a way that 4 years in the yard and 18 months outside it had not revised it. Snorts? He quit the job at the warehouse 2 weeks later. He moved to Bakersfield, which was where he had come from before Corcoran, and which received him back with the specific neutrality that places receive people who have been away for a while, and who return changed in ways that the place is not organized to recognize. He trained differently than he had trained before the Thursday afternoon in Gardena, with a specific quality of attention to the things he had not previously been attending to, the things that the 8 seconds had identified as the gaps between his model of the situation and the situation itself. He found a gym. He worked with a trainer who had competed seriously on the circuit in the 1970s and who showed him things that the yard had not shown him about distance and timing and the specific management of the variables that make size and forward pressure available or unavailable depending on the choices the man across from you is making about the space between you. He trained with the quality of a man who has received an education he was not seeking and who has decided that the education, however it arrived, and whatever it cost, was more useful than the understanding it replaced. Chuck drove back to the valley. He trained the following morning the way he trained every morning, which was with complete attention to the work and without any of the residue that the previous day's events leave in men who have not yet separated the events from the practice, because the practice was the practice and it did not require the events to be relevant to it, and it did not allow the events to be irrelevant to the specific quality of attention the practice required regardless of what the events had contained. He worked through the combinations. He worked through the kicks. He worked through the footwork and the distance management and the reading of committed movement that 26 years of practice had built into him below the level of conscious decision. He did the work the way he had always done the work, which was because the work was worth doing, and because the worth of it did not depend on anyone watching, and did not depend on any particular encounter having recently demonstrated the worth in a warehouse in Gardena or anywhere else. Clear's throat. The worth was prior to the demonstration. The demonstration was simply what happened when the worth encountered a situation that required it to be expressed. The expression took 8 seconds. Then it was finished and the worth went back to being what it was before the 8 seconds, which was the prior and permanent condition of a man who had been honest about building it for long enough that it had stopped being something he had and had become something he was.